Morning, everybody. Are you sitting comfortably? Then we'll begin. Thank you. Welcome to all members and officers present. We don't have any speakers this morning, and we don't have anybody in the public gallery, so it's just a welcome to those two groups of people. So thank you for your attendance this morning. I'm just going to mention, I'm not going to read it all out. I think you know what this is now. Just to remind you that when speaking, please use your microphones and do the appropriate things like being close enough and switching it off and on, etc., and all the rest. So that aids a fluent meeting. Next, declarations of interest. First, I have a declaration of a personal interest because I am a filed representative on the Blackpool Enterprise Zone project board, which I have to say hasn't met yet in that time, but that's my interest. Confirmation. Oh, are there any other declarations of interest? No. Okay, thank you. Confirmation of minutes. The last meeting was held on the 4th of September.
No, I'd like to comment on it.
Yeah, of course you can, yes.
This is a regulatory committee, not a political committee. I'm not here to score political points. We're all here to arrive at decisions we have confidence in by following correct procedures. In the Constitution, there's the member officer protocol for planning. Now, I watched the recording of the last meeting, and I believe that two members didn't conform to that protocol. And others tried to justify that non-conformance. I believe it's up to the chair to ensure that we conform to that protocol. So can I ask that all members look at the Constitution, look at the member officer protocol on planning. Remember that these meetings are recorded, they're available to view by the public. We often have members of the public attending. Now, I say this not to score any political points, but to avoid any criticism or complaints about this committee. Thank you, Chair.
Comments are duly noted. Thank you. Of minutes. Yes. Yes, I'm saying, real proposing. Seconding? Thank you, Councillor Settle. Councillor Collins proposed. Councillor Settle seconding. Thank you. Substitute members. Do we have any substitute members this morning?
Thank you, Chairman. No, we've got apologies from Councillor Griffiths, but no substitute members.
So we move to item 1, which is on page 3 of the report. Well, both items are mentioned there, and then page 5. And we've got Matthew Taylor, who will be presenting this morning. So thank you, Matthew, for being here. And as there are no speakers, Matthew will make his full presentation, and then we'll move to questions and then the debate as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and good morning to members of the committee. So the first application on the agenda relates to the Richmond Point development on the east side of Queensway, Lytham St Anne's. No doubt several of our members will be familiar with this, and we've dealt with a series of recent applications on here. I will run through some background. But ultimately, this application relates to the temporary junction via Salisbury Avenue into the Richmond Point development and a section of what's known as the T5 road, which runs to the north or will run to the north in the future, and the conditions that relate to that imposed on the outline permission. So at the moment, there's a condition on that permission which requires this temporary access to be stopped up on the 166th occupation, or no more than 165 dwellings, is the wording in the condition. The application is to extend that to allow up to 225, so a further 60 dwellings, to be occupied before this temporary junction is stopped up. The reason for that is that the permanent signalised junction at Kilnhouse Lane is not yet in place, and house building is approaching that trigger. The second aspect of the application is to delay the provision of the T5 road, the east-west road, which runs to the north of the site, until the occupation of the 450th dwelling. That will bring it in line with what is written in the Section 106 agreement. So in terms of background, the original outline application was approved with access via this 5-arm roundabout in 2012. There's a condition attached to the original planning permission that required this to be built before anything else happened, before any dwellings on the site were constructed. However, in 2017, there was a separate full application for 66 dwellings, which included the temporary access off Queensway, as it exists today, that priority junction via Salisbury Avenue. That access was initially used as a construction access and a resident access, and a condition was imposed requiring it to be stopped up prior to the occupation of the 66th dwelling, which tied in with phase 1 of the development. That application was varied to increase the 66th dwelling trigger to allow no more than 165 dwellings to be occupied before that temporary access was closed, and that equated to the end of phase 2. After that application, a separate permission was granted for what's known as the interim Queensway junction, shown in the bottom right here. So this is a signalised junction that in effect replaces the roundabout up until such a time as the T5 road is constructed. The construction of the T5 road is now in the gift of Lancashire County Council rather than the developer, following changes to the Section 106 agreement. So in terms of the T5, this is the road that runs across the northern edge of the development. This is what's known as T6, or the M55 link road, and is now Lytham St Anne's Way after being opened in June. So the outline planning permission approves a road that connects the Queensway roundabout, as it was, to the M55 link road here in the east. There was a modification to the Section 106 in 2021 that removed the requirement for the developer to construct T5 and gift this land effectively to Lancashire County Council, which puts it in LCC's gift to build T5 in the future. That offer expires either 10 years from the construction of the 550th dwelling or on the 1st of January 2041, whichever occurs first. So it's a long-term project that's now in the gift of LCC. What the change to the 106 also required was the construction of a different east-west road, which we have an application for at the moment that's presently undetermined, that will represent an extension of Parkinson Boulevard emerging onto T6 down here. However, there's a discrepancy between what the 106 says and what condition 19 of the outline permission says as to the trigger for the construction of this east-west road. So the 106 requires that no more than 450 dwellings shall be occupied, but the condition requires no more than 375 dwellings shall be occupied. So the condition and the 106 don't line up at the moment. So this is a longer term strategy. I mentioned phases 1 and 2. So those two together equate to 165 dwellings. The developer is presently building out parcel 4. So in the longer term, this is the temporary access which would be stopped up once the interim Queensway junction is constructed. That includes an access road here up to Parkinson Boulevard, and Parkinson Boulevard would continue through to the east and then onto the T6 road. So we've currently got a separate application in for this stretch of the road to effectively connect the end of Parkinson Boulevard up to T6. So that's ongoing at the moment, but that's the longer term strategy. What we've got at the moment, the interim Queensway junction hasn't been constructed. Some groundworks have happened, some pre-loading works to allow the construction of the road at a later date. There's a separate haul road up here for construction vehicles. So the signage at this temporary access and construction vehicles are not to use this access. They come in via this haul road. At the moment, Parkinson Boulevard is a cul-de-sac. It terminates here. That will connect in with the interim Queensway junction once that is constructed, and that will become the main arterial route through the estate. All access would be taken from there. So at the moment, or as of April 2024, approximately 138 dwellings had been constructed on the site, so the developers approaching the 165 dwelling trigger in the current condition. So the use of this temporary access through Salisbury Avenue needs to be extended to avoid any breach of that trigger. So this is the access as it exists at the moment. It's a very wide radius onto Queensway, what's known as a Bellmouth junction, where construction vehicles previously used this for phase 1 as the main means of access, alongside residential traffic before the haul road was put in place. So this is the view from the south. You can see the signalised junction here with Kilnhouse Lane. That assists the operation of the junction. It creates gaps in traffic, which allows vehicles to enter and exit off Queensway. And then same view looking from the north. So in addition to the temporary access, there was a scheme when this was approved that also included other off-site highway works. So there's a pedestrian refuge up here to cross over Queensway that's already in place. You can see that the cul-de-sac turning head has already been marked out when the road was constructed. So this access from here is to be closed, and there'll be a 3.5 metre wide footway and pedestrian link onto Queensway, similar to this arrangement with landscaping at the side of it. So that's presently required before the 166th occupation. There's this shared footway and cycleway on the east side of Queensway. Part of that is in place up to the edge of Mellingswood here. That's to be extended further to the south, and a toucan crossing opposite Miller and Carter, approximately over here on this over Hayhouses Lane. Again, that's tied to the stopping up of the temporary access on the 166th occupation. So this is the stretch that will join into Parkinson Boulevard of the interim Queensway junction. It should be noted that the trigger in the condition refers to an either-or scenario. So it's either a certain number of dwellings are occupied, or the junction is constructed and open to traffic. So this is described as the interim junction because in the longer term, LCC have the option to construct the T5 road, which would require some reconfiguration and effectively an expansion of this junction. So ground preparation works for this stretch have taken place on the site. The developer anticipates that there'll be a 6-month build-out period, but the main reason for the delay at present is completing what's known as a Section 278 agreement. It's a legal agreement with Lancashire County Council, which will allow the works to occur within the adopted highway. So just to summarise the scope of the proposal, so to alter the trigger in condition 16 to raise the number of dwellings that can take access through the temporary access with Salisbury Avenue, rather than the interim Queensway junction, from 165 to 225 dwellings. So that's traffic from a further 60 dwellings travelling through the temporary junction. Condition 17 relates to that by delaying the blocking up of the temporary access until the occupation of the 226th dwelling. And that relates to occupation of the dwelling rather than the construction. So the current condition refers to the construction of the 166th dwelling, whereas the amendment to the condition would relate it to the occupation of the 226th dwelling. The change to condition 19 delays the provision of the Hay Houses bypass T5 East West Road till the occupation of the 450th dwelling rather than the 375th. So 75 extra dwellings to align with what's in the 106. As I mentioned, the main reasons for this is the delay to the construction of the interim Queensway Junction due to issues completing the legal agreement with LCC. Once that agreement completes, there's then approximate 6-month build-out period for the actual junction, which would follow that. And the need to increase this trigger is to prevent house building on Richmond Point stalling beyond the 165th occupation under the current wording of the condition. The change to condition 19, as I mentioned, is to bring the wording of the condition in alignment with what the 106 says. So in terms of the main issues, the questions here are really principally related to highway safety. So will the current temporary Queensway Salisbury Avenue junction provide a safe and suitable means of access to Richmond Point for the additional traffic associated with a further 60 dwellings? So we're looking at the additional impact above and beyond what the existing wording of the condition allows. The second issue is, does altering the triggers in the conditions give rise to any effects which would result in a severe residual cumulative impact on network capacity? So we're looking at two issues, highway safety and network capacity. I've included the existing wording of the condition with the sections that have been removed crossed out and the sections that have been added highlighted red. So this is simply raising the trigger from 165 to 225. The second part of this is removing reference to what was effectively the Queensway roundabout with T5 and replacing that with the reference to the interim Queensway junction, the signalised junction that's been approved since that roundabout, and with reference to that planning permission. Similarly, with conditions 17, that refers to the off-site highway works that I mentioned in terms of the Toucan crossing and extension of the foot and cycleway, while also altering the dwelling number trigger. I've highlighted the words or and whichever is the sooner to emphasise that that access is to be stopped up either on the occupation of the 226 dwelling or as soon as the interim Queensway junction and all the associated highway works are available for use. So whichever of those happens first will trigger the closure of the temporary access. And then condition 19 is much more limited in that it simply replaces the dwelling number trigger from 375 to 450. I would just mention that the wording of this condition will need to change in the future in the event that the new east-west road connecting through to Lytham St Anne's Way is approved at a later date. So in terms of the highway impact, the applicant's done modelling of the temporary junction to show how it functions and what the impact of the additional traffic from a further 60 dwellings taking access through that junction would be. So in terms of trip generation, that is estimated to generate a further 36 and 40 trips through the junction in the peak AM and PM periods arising from those 60 additional dwellings, and a total of 132 and 149 trips during the same period. I've included this table here, which is taken out of the Transport Note and referred to by the local highway authority in their comments. So this shows the different approaches, so exiting the site, turning left, exiting, turning right, and entering the site from Queensway, turning right. Effectively, what these numbers show are how saturated the junction is. So a value here, this is the highest value, 0.25. Any value between 0 and 0.85 represents stable operating conditions, and a value in excess of 1 represents overloaded conditions. So really what this shows is that there's quite a lot of headroom and capacity within the existing junction with the additional traffic from the development for 225 dwellings in place. The mean maximum queue is effectively how many vehicles are joining the back of the queue before it clears. Again, that's significantly less than 1. So really, this is what LCC Highways have referred to in their comments when they advise that the junction will still operate well within theoretical capacity following occupation of 60 more dwellings using the junction and the internal road network. So there isn't a capacity issue with the junction as it's designed at the moment. In terms of some other points, the geometry of the junction allows vehicles exiting the site turning right and left to wait side by side. That reduces queuing times. The timing of the traffic lights at Kilnhouse Lane assists manoeuvres into and out of the junction. I mentioned earlier that effectively there's gaps in traffic created when those lights turn red that allow cars to enter and exit the site more effectively. The temporary junction's also been in operation for more than 5 years, and there's no recorded collisions resulting in injury attributable to the operation of the junction. So this is something that's mentioned in LCC Highways advice regarding the safety of that junction and how it operates at present. And then the final point is the opening of the M55 link road has brought relief to congestion on Queensway. So there's a lot less traffic on Queensway now than there was before it opened. I've included some figures here which are from the modelling report for the M55 link road. So there hasn't been any actual measurements taken since it opened, but this was a prediction at the time that the link road was allowed as to what the impact would be on Queensway. So that predicted a 24% reduction in southbound traffic, so entering into St Anne's, and a 12% reduction in northbound traffic leaving St Anne's. So a significant reduction when you think about how many vehicles would use Queensway on a day-to-day basis. In terms of the change to condition 19, I've mentioned the discrepancy between what the 106 says and what the condition says. So the purpose of doing that is to bring those two in alignment. It isn't changing anything in that sense, in the sense that the 106 allows 450 dwellings before the east-west road is brought into place, rather than 375. So it's simply bringing the two in line with one another following the previous approval of the amendment to the Section 106 in 2021. So in terms of summarising the main issues, the temporary access will continue to operate safely and with ample spare capacity, with the additional traffic from a further 60 dwellings in place. It ensures a safe and suitable means of access for 225 dwellings prior to the interim Queensway junction being constructed. There's no severe residual cumulative impact on network capacity arising from the delays in the provision of the interim Queensway junction or the east-west road, and there are no objections from the local highway authority on safety or capacity grounds. In terms of character and appearance, there's already a scheme that's approved that I mentioned to stop up the access, which includes that 3.5 metre wide shared cycle path and footway through a landscaped strip. That isn't altered in any way. That requirement still exists. That scheme's still approved and is referenced in the conditions. So there's no different effects on the character and appearance of the area arising from the variations, other than the provision of that would be delayed by 60 dwellings. In terms of amenity impacts, the use of temporary access will require more traffic passing the dwellings on Salisbury Avenue. However, there's no significant adverse amenity impacts arising from that in terms of noise or other nuisance to occupiers along Salisbury Avenue. Once the interim Queensway junction is opened, traffic will pass the properties on Parkinson Boulevard in a similar way. So the original outline permission was EIA development, so the environmental statement and shadow habitat regulations assessment have been reconsidered, as is required for Section 73 application, There's no additional mitigation above and beyond the nature park and farmland conservation area that's already been put in place that's required to deal with the impacts arising from the variations to the conditions. There's also been a change to the wording of conditions 14 and 15, which have been updated to refer to those off-site highway works I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So stopping up the access, putting in the landscaping and the footpath and cycle path through the cul-de-sac, the southerly extension of the footway and cycleway on the east side of Queensway, and the Toucan crossing. That condition's been amended to refer to this revised timescale of 225 rather than 165 dwellings. So the resolution is for members to delegate to the head of planning to grant planning permission, subject to the approval of an application to amend the current Section 106 agreement, to modify the definitions of planning permission, which will need to include reference to this application, and also the triggers for the stopping up of the temporary access to match through with the conditions, along with the adoption of the updated shadow habitat regulations assessment and the other conditions set out in the agenda papers. So on that basis, the application is recommended for approval.
Thank you very much, Matthew. So we've moved through two of the phases when we're deliberating on applications. You've had the report, you've had the presentation presented by Matthew this morning, and now we move into the phase where we have questions and then the debate. So open to members. First of all, Councillor Evans, thank you.
Good morning, Chair. Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much, Matthew, for the presentation. Just got a couple of points to make on this one, really. I mean, there's a lot of detail in there, but we do, on small developments of just a few houses, we put a lot of conditions in place to make sure that those developments meet the statutory requirements. And I'm a little concerned, while this appears to be just structural amendments, previous committees have met to discuss this large housing development, and in good faith conditions are put in place to make sure that the infrastructure that was required to harmoniously incorporate a large-scale development into the borough have been met, and the road interconnections with existing roads on Queensway are an important part of that consideration when the initial planning permission was granted. So I'm somewhat concerned that now at this stage, while that infrastructure isn't forthcoming, we're now being asked to delegate powers to allow the developer to complete the houses that are required and are set out in the original application. I think the developer has a responsibility to the people who've bought houses in phase one, that they bought those houses in good faith, expecting that the infrastructure would be forthcoming. And now that's not the case at this stage. A couple of the questions I've got are in particular, you said LCC have the option to complete a T5 road. Well, I would have thought that would be an obligation rather than an option, because originally it was the developer's responsibility to develop that road, as I understand it, and that now has been passed to LCC. So I'd like some clarification on whether it is an option or it's an obligation. And I'm also concerned that while it would appear, have a lack of infrastructure in making sure that the planning conditions are met on some of our applications, it's really important with large-scale developments that those requirements that are set out in the original planning considerations and meetings are then not watered down or not met at a later stage. And I don't believe that it is acceptable that the interconnectability of those sites as is left until the very end of the housing development. They should be brought along in conjunction with those developments. So they're my points, and at this stage, I'm not minded to support the application as it sits in front of us. Thank you very much.
Would you like me to get a response from officers?
Yes,
You
and I'd
made-
like to
you
come
made, I
back
think,
again if
three
necessary.
significant points there. Okay.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you.
I've just brought this slide up just to kind of clarify in terms of where the 225 dwelling trigger sits. So this is phase one, that was 65 dwellings. Phase two, that was 100. So at the moment, it requires that temporary access to be stopped up in the new junction after these two phases are built or occupied. The developer's presently in parcel 4, which is, I believe, 130 dwellings. So in terms of the 225 trigger, that would allow a further parcel of dwellings within, well, a further group of dwellings within this parcel to be occupied. It wouldn't relate to, there's 856 dwellings across the site as a whole that have been approved. So this temporary access would relate only to parcels 1, 2, and a collection within parcel 4 before this interim Queensway junction comes into place. I mean, in terms of the permission for the interim Queensway junction has been in place for a while, since 2020, that 2022 application, but the delay really is with Lancashire County Council and agreeing the legal agreement and getting technical approval for the works within the adopted highway. The applicant tells me that that process has been ongoing since 2022, but they're struggling with capacity and resource at LCC to process it. So it is really an issue with the County Council and the Highway Authority in that respect, in terms of why it's been delayed for so long. The developer wants to build the junction, they're motivated to build the junction because it's effectively a selling point for their houses. And I believe they've had some feedback about the temporary junction being difficult to navigate or representing a kind of convoluted route into the site from some of the prospective purchasers. So I don't believe that there's any deliberate reason for delaying the junction other than simply they haven't been able to get the legal agreement over the line. What's important from our perspective is that house building doesn't stop on Richmond Point while the issues relating to that junction are there to be resolved. Obviously, that would harm our own housing targets and deliverability figures. So really, the question here is about the temporary access and whether or not that's suitable to take access for 225 dwellings. So the evidence, the transport evidence suggests that it is, and there's still quite a lot of spare capacity left within that access, and that it can operate safely. So that's really the question. It's the impact of the change to the condition rather than the reasons why the applicant wants to change it that's kind of before the committee, and that's the way that the application needs to be assessed. What is the effect of changing those triggers? In terms of the question about the T5 road, as I've mentioned, this is something that is now in LCC's gift. So there was a change to the Section 106 agreement in 2021 that effectively removed the developer's responsibility to construct T5, providing that they gifted the land to LCC, which gives them an option to build it in the future. It isn't a requirement, it is an option for LCC to build T5, but there is then a requirement for the developer to build an alternative east-west road, so there will still be a connection onto T6, and that's the purpose of this current application we've got here, to create this link instead of T5. So that would just be an easterly extension of Parkinson Boulevard, so that link will still happen, it will just happen in a different place and in a different configuration to T5. As I mentioned in the presentation, it's quite a long time frame that LCC have an option to build T5. 10 years from the construction of the 550th dwelling or on the 1st of January 2041. So it is a long-term project, and ultimately it will be up to LCC to determine whether or not the construction of that road is needed or warranted. But for the purposes of Richmond Point, the extension of that road there is to serve the development, whereas T5 was a much more strategic road to serve much more than just Richmond Point.
I'm going to give you the
Quickly.
opportunity. Just
Thank
in
you very
case
much.
anything's been missed or you want to comment on that, Councillor Evans.
As a naturally cynical man, I think it's highly unlikely that LCC will ever build that road, but that's just my own personal view. I also note that the proposed pedestrian crossing is quite some way down. If it's down at Miller and Carter, it's quite some way down from the temporary access to the site at the moment. I also note that 39 objections, which we didn't discuss in the presentation, but 39 presumably residents that already live there have, which is approximately 50% of the proposed increase of houses. So it's a significant number of people have been minded to object on the basis of the fact that, just to summarise, that the temporary road, although the developers have said that it's not supposed to be being used by contractors, is being used by contractors. And in turn, presumably because of that heavy load vehicle, the traffic calming measures on that road are now deteriorating. So if, as it's quite possible, esteemed colleagues decide to support this application, may I respectfully request that a further condition is put on to the developers that they actually replace or improve, repair those traffic calming measures, and it's also their responsibility to maintain those while this temporary route is still being used. And I think it's unfortunate in reality that so often we hear that large developments are progressed without the required infrastructure to integrate them into our area. And so, you know, it feels very much like we're sort of rubbing our hands and saying, well, it's in the hands of LCC now, and there's not an awful lot we can do about it. So it doesn't sit well with me. But thank you very much for your answers.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to further comment at all, Matthew, on anything that Councillor Evans has just?
Well, just in terms of the construction traffic, there is a separate dedicated haul road where the heavy construction vehicles would access the site. There's a series of, you know, and anybody who kind of goes along Queensway will see the Fox Brothers wagons bringing fill onto the site through the construction haul road. They don't use this access because they know that they're not to. I suspect that there may be some subcontractors that occasionally come through this access, but what the construction compound does do is, off the haul road, it takes you directly through to the construction compound, so it's a dedicated separate access. The condition of the road is, it is finally surfaced, other than this first bit of the temporary access. That's largely because this is to be stopped up. So at the moment, everything else is finally surfaced. There's a rumble strip here, and then this surface meets that rumble strip. Everything else after that is final surfaced. So it really, this has been delayed from being finally surfaced because it's a temporary arrangement, so it wouldn't make sense to finally surface that road until it's going to become a cul-de-sac. So there's basically a base course here at the moment along this stretch, and then from this rumble strip onwards, it's all fully surfaced. Again, you can see the base course on Parkinson Boulevard down here, so that there aren't any issues with the kind of condition of the highway that have been raised by the Highway Authority. There will be some bits where it's become loose, perhaps around this rumble strip, but it isn't something that the Highway Authority have raised as a safety or an amenity issue, and they haven't requested any alterations to the highway to compensate for that.
The other comment I would make is if you look on page 9 of the report, you'll see that there's a long history, isn't there, with this particular site, which was actually allowed at appeal. 080058 originally, I think, well, I know that there were 1,150 dwellings. And since then, there have been different S73 applications, etc., that have taken it down, I think, to 856, I think, at the moment. So there's been a substantial reduction in the number of houses on this site. The reason I'm pointing that out, Councillor Evans, is that with massive developments, my experience has been that over time, there are often sometimes changes of ownership in terms of, the use of parcels of land. There are often changes to some of the designated status of some of those areas. And I think one of the things that we have to be conscious of is measuring and being sure about the impact of those changes and whether that substantially is significantly changing something. And that's a factor as well to take into account. But I take your points and they're well made.
May I, Chairman, before we move on, I'd also suggest that the conditions on pages 46 to 50 relating specifically to this perhaps could be reviewed in the light of some of Councillor Evans' comments before the head of planning does give authority, if that's what the committee decides.
Okay. Councillor Goodman, thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I was on the St Anne's Town Council Planning Committee in 2012. We were very excited to think that we may have a roundabout at the Queensway Kilnhouse Road. It's an absolute nightmare and still is, I'm afraid, at peak times. Particularly coming up from Kilnhouse Lane, most cars are going through on red because it's a permanent, coming from St Anne's along to Queensway, a permanent line of traffic. That's between 8 and 9 and 5 and 6 at night. So my concern about that temporary exit has always been a concern. Just to say, going back to what Councillor Evans has said, is that a lot of the heavy loading wagons are parking up on the old Easterley Road, which the kennels were along there, runs along the side of the Richmond Point. I'm not sure if there is an entrance there, but there seems to be a lot of movement of heavy vehicles. It's now, of course, not the kennels, they burnt down, but there is an industrial plant up there and a recycling plant, which I have visited. With regard, if you don't mind me saying, I hate to be negative about the Link Road. Unfortunately, if you live in Anstall toward Lytham, it's great, but all us St Anne's folk would find we'd have to travel all the way to Lytham beyond Anstall to join that Link Road. So we still use the Kilnhouse Road and the Queensway Link, and it's very, very busy. This is regardless of the extra 225, I should say not extra, the extra bringing it from 165 to 225 dwellings. I think that's another point. My concern is with regard to the junctions, and as Matthew mentioned, the highway safety. And I'm not entirely sure that the chart that we were given right at the very end is actually correct with regard to the amount of traffic on that road still. Again, it's observations only, but it does concern me. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Goodman. Councillor Settle.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillors Evans and Goodman have just covered the point I wanted to make, but I want to go into it further. The East-West Road, you mentioned that, Matthew, that the Section 106 agreement changed. It's no responsibility of LCC. You didn't understand explain the thinking behind that. why on earth would they want to do such a thing? But you also mentioned that, if I've got it right, we're now going to have two east-west roads. The original one, the strategic one, which is the one that we would all use, and then a minor one running through the estate, which nobody will use apart from anybody on the estate, unless they want you to use it as a rat run. And I don't think the estate people would appreciate that. So just going back to the original one, and you had the screen up there showing condition 19, I'm still confused because it mentions the East-West Road will be built by house number 450. Which East-West Road are you talking about there? There's two of them now.
Yeah, so the wording of the 106, the latter part of the 106 is different to the wording of condition 19. So this condition refers to the T5 road,
That's the original East-West
Yes.
Road. Right.
whereas the 106 refers to different options, either the T5
So-
road or
So do you know the background behind this? What I consider to be a really strange 106 arrangement. Why on earth would LCC want to take over building of that road when Kensington were originally going to build it? Why would they want to do that?
I was going to defer to Mark then in terms of his knowledge of the link road and such like.
Yeah, I think, well, first of all, in regard to this particular matter, this committee has already agreed to this in terms of the changes that would
I
have
just
the
think a lot of
106.
us weren't on that though at the time.
But like I say, it's a decision of this council
Yeah.
to go along this route. So whatever this is, but for the benefit of those people who weren't on the committee at that time, the question of the delivery of the link roads, both the T5 and the T6, all came down to when they would be delivered. So the original planning permission that was granted on appeal and that the chairman has referred to required contributions to be made to Lancashire County Council, and those were triggered at various points. And the final trigger to actually put in place the cash to build the road was not, and so I can't remember what the numbers are off the top of my head, but I think it was something like 650 or so, but it was quite a long way in. Now, all that required was the delivery of the cash. It didn't require the road to be built. So this council took a decision, so that would have obviously taken a long time because it was based on build-out rates, and as we've heard already, we've not even got halfway there now. So that would be many years hence before the money would be available to build the link road. And then obviously there would be a requirement for LCC to build the link road. So rather than wait all that time, a decision was taken to look at ways in which to accelerate the delivery of the road. And the council, not just this committee, but the council took decisions to help to contribute towards that accelerated delivery. That has resulted in the North-South road being delivered, which is the road that has been recently opened. And that obviously serves more the traffic down towards Lytham and Ansdell rather than St Anne's. But what it does do is it means that the traffic that would have previously come from Lytham and Ansdell and gone up through Queensway along Clifton Drive and up Squiresgate Lane now has another option. So it spreads out those options. All that was taken into consideration, as well as the way in which the costs of delivering that road went up exponentially over the years. And also the background traffic in general in Lancashire and in the local area was falling. So the justification for the wider road network was somewhat less. If you want to go back even further in time, the east-west part, the T5 part, actually continued on across and went up, and then a new bypass around Wharton, and then connected into the Freckleton bypass. That was the original plan, to actually bring a new road right around the back of all the developments that are along the estuary side. And obviously over years, changes in policy, changes in background traffic, etc., have meant that those approaches have changed. So ideas of getting people to use public transport rather than use the private car were sort of more focused on funding going towards public transport rather than road building, and those plans were amended over the years. So the top and bottom of it is that the money that could be achieved to deliver the road only allowed us to be able to afford the north-south part of the road, the T6 part of the road. LCC looked at that and they considered with various changes that the T5 part was not required for general traffic. However, there was a requirement to deliver a link into the site itself to try to spread the traffic that was emerging from that new development site, so that some would go towards the new link road and other parts would go along the new junction that we're talking about today. So having sort of modelled all that, the conclusion is that the solution that we've got today is acceptable for the way things stand today. There is an option for LCC to be gifted the land effectively in the future, that's been mentioned by Matthew, and that remains in place. I think that will very much depend on whether that road in the future is required, having regard to background traffic, etc. So another assessment will be carried out at that date, and it may well be that they decline that option to take that forward based on how traffic stands in the more distant future. So that's where we stand as a background, and what, in a very sort of relatively short nutshell of what are very long reports that were considered by this committee and by the council going back over the last few years.
So, sorry, can you just clarify? So you're saying that the developer was only ever going to give a percentage contribution to the East-West Road, not 100% of it?
No,
which is the similar situation to the Link Road. They're only ever under a percentage, not 100%.
No, there is a requirement for them to build the
road?
to fund the road in its entirety. That was the original.
And so that original money, is that now being used to build the southern East-West Road now?
No, so the money has been spent on the north-south road.
On the north-south road?
Yeah.
Oh, I just was trying to make sure Kensington, Roland Owens without getting off route. So you're saying they're still spending the same amount of money, but it's gone on the north-south one instead?
No, I would say that the amount of money spent by the developer was considerably less than was originally, or would have been the case had they had to fund it through themselves. But that came down to viability. So there were figures in the budgets in terms of building all the roads, which came to somewhere originally when in 2008, the viability studies showed that the figures were somewhere in the region of £10 million to build both roads. And I think the north-south road itself, I think it's cost 27. Yeah. So obviously you can see, that's twice as much to build half of the amount of roads.
I think where I'm getting confused is Article 19, I don't find very helpful at all, Condition 19. If I read that word, it doesn't mention all the money and all the situation. It still suggests to me the developer is still building the East-West Road. It's just not clear, the wording. Maybe I think that's what's caused the confusion.
Yeah, I think that this is the difficulty in terms of where the Section 106 has been updated without changing the wording of Condition 19.
Right.
So really the purpose of this application is to bring, or in terms of Condition 19, is to bring the trigger in line with what's in the 106. The wording of the rest of it that mentions the T5 road and all the infrastructure and the Moss Sluice roundabout that's associated with that will change at a later date in the event that permission is granted for this new link. So effectively, all the wording at the end of the condition would simply be altered to refer to this new link rather than the T5 road. So we're doing this in stages, if you like, but we can't alter that wording until this road is approved, and that's the subject of the separate application.
Okay, I think you understand me, thanks. I think the problem is now is that, to use some slightly non-legal language, we're stuck with this. We're stuck with the 106 agreement, can't turn the clock back. So it's almost like a fait accompli to me. You either do that or you don't do anything. So, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Pittman.
Thank you, Chair. I've I do appreciate the report that Matthew gave, which I found quite illuminating, and also what Mark said. I'm a bit cynical, like Councillor Evans, and my first response to this was, well, the can's going down the road and they're all kicking it. My question is, how long is it before they're going to come back again to get another review of whether the roads can accommodate the traffic? Because is it 60 that we've extended it by? Did you say 60? Yeah, I think it was something like
Yeah,
that.
that's what this
So
application's
basically,
for.
what
Yeah.
is their build-out rate at the moment before they're going to come back again to say, oh, there's still some headroom. We don't need to get alarmed about anything. The road can take it. How long is it likely, bearing in mind that maybe they're not going to develop as fast as we originally thought?
Well, in terms of the anticipated build-out rate that we have in our kind of 5-year housing land supply document would be 30 dwellings a year. Obviously, that's building the dwellings, not actually having them sold and occupied. So we're at around about 138 at the moment. So there's still, several years left in that until you could get to the 225 figure. But really, this does come down to the highway safety and capacity of that junction. In terms of the use of this junction, to be clear, it isn't putting any more traffic onto Queensway than would be the case if the interim junction was in place. It's putting them in a different place, and obviously they're taking a different means of access. So it isn't increasing the amount of traffic on the network. It's just putting those vehicles onto the network in a different position. But really, the issue from our perspective is that it's important that house building continues on Richmond Point in the interim, and there is a lot of headroom in that junction, so it would be very difficult to contest those figures in terms of if you think how far away this figure, for example, is from being at any point where it actually becomes overloaded that might justify a highway capacity reason. There aren't any kind of accident records associated with the operation of this junction to suggest that there's a highway safety reason. So this is really where I'm coming from. It's not so much to do with are the developers' reasons for delaying the junction good enough. It's what is the impact of putting that additional traffic through that junction? Is there a highway safety or a capacity issue? That's really the main question to ask ourselves as part of this application.
Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Dixon and then Councillor Collins.
Thanks, Chair. It takes you back to my old job, and I think we counted up 67 different meetings about the T5 and the T6 with the developer and various government agencies. And this isn't the last developer. The last developer that had this site, as we know, came to every single meeting with changes in what they wanted to do, what they should do, what they could do, and what they wouldn't do. It was nightmarish. I know the site's changed hands since then, and it's been run on this. And I have kept in touch with some of the people on the site, and I do know that there are delays at Lancashire County Council. So while I am sceptical about a developer always wanting to push the envelope and get more houses before they put the infrastructure in, I do know that there are delays down there, and I think it'd be wrong to stop a development going ahead because of that when we've got figures like those up there. So I am minded to support it. I am still quite sceptical about it. But I think the difficulty is we all sit here still, but when they're going to build the T6 road, and the T6 is off the table now. It might get built, it might not get built. As a council, we have already voted to accept that fact. So we need to sort of clear our minds of that. What needs to happen is that road, east-west, needs to be built through that estate, absolutely for sure, connecting. I think they will actually build the T6 at some point. They went to considerable expense building a spur on the roundabout to put that in there. And they could have put that road in without that stuff on there. But they made, I think they actually had to go and dig some extra pots of money out. I think Neil Stevens told me to make sure that that did happen last minute. So I'm minded to support it. I am sceptical, but I do know that there are delays at Lancashire County Council. So I think I might give them the benefit of the doubt at this stage. Thank you.
Councillor Collins.
Thank you, Chair. It's more of a general comment. On this site, there's been a reduction in numbers from 948 to 856, so that's 92 less than were originally envisaged. We're going to have increased housing targets in this borough. We might have to take some of the requirements from adjacent boroughs. So, going forward, can we have a presumption against the reduction in the numbers granted permission when we've got X amount in a planning permission, somebody comes back for a reduced number? Because those 92 have to be built somewhere else. They could well end up being on a greenfield site in my ward, in anybody's ward, when we've already had permission in St Anne's here.
Yeah. In terms of this particular application, there isn't any impact associated with that, with altering dwelling numbers. The committee has approved previous applications to reduce dwelling numbers at the site on the basis that we had a lot more houses in our supply and were allocated than were required under the current standard method for calculating our housing need. So that, in tandem with some improvements to the layout and a lower density development, justified granting those permissions. There is a separate application from the developer to alter similarly to parcels 3 and 4, parcels 5, 6, 7 and 8 in a similar manner, albeit that isn't part of this application. That would come to the committee separately and would be considered at that time based on what the position was at the time that it comes to the committee in terms of our housing figures. But it's not something that's affected specifically by this application, albeit that if the application wasn't approved, there's the risk that house building stalls at the 165th occupation.
Are there any further? Yes, Councillor Settle.
Sorry, Chairman, just a clarification. Councillor Dixon just mentioned the East-West Road, the northerly one, the original one, which has now got a mini roundabout waiting for it on the Links Road, which is good. On the southerly one, I can't see the detail of that drawing. Well, that also have a roundabout or a T-junction.
So, yeah, this plan is to show indicatively where that road is. Like I say, there is a separate application that deals with the detailed design of that, but it is a priority junction. It isn't a traffic light junction. So just a give-way junction.
It's just that a roundabout's a lot safer way of getting onto a major road rather than a normal junction. It would be nice to have a roundabout. Not more expensive.
Yeah, obviously LCC will have to comment on that. It's a separate application that isn't part of this scheme, so that will come before the committee separately. But LCC will be looking at that aspect of it. What I would say about this junction is, if there are aspects of the design as it's presently submitted where it kind of narrows into a one way, and it's not there as an arterial route through the site. It's there as kind of an estate road for this development. So that's really the distinction between the east-west road that's proposed here. This is to serve Richmond Point, whereas, as Mark mentioned earlier, the T5 was a much more strategic route to serve other developments in addition to Richmond Point.
Councillor Evans.
Thank you, Chair. I'll be as brief as I can. I can see the direction of travel there, so I just want to reiterate the point that we could perhaps do something to alleviate some of the pressures of existing residents. I'd go on to page 19. The applicant's transport evidence does not consider the impacts of the increased traffic in and out of the estate via the current temporary access on Salisbury Avenue. Raising the number of dwellings takes access via Salisbury Avenue from 165 to 225, which represents a 36% increase in vehicles. Despite the applicant erecting signs at the temporary access, this is still being used by construction vehicles. This creates added conflicts with other road users and further deterioration of the road surface. I think it needs to be a condition placed. You know, I take on board Matthew's point that, well, it's a temporary road. So, you know, when the bit's not temporary, it's been finished. Well, it's, you know, like I often say in these meetings, when is a temporary road not a temporary road? Well, when it lasts for 4 or 5 years, and you can argue that, you know, it needs to be looked at slightly differently. So I would request that we put a further condition on the developers that if they are going to be granted the permission to continue building properties, that they have a requirement to their existing residents to try and mitigate the impact on that road as much as possible. And my final point is, yes, there may well be a reduction in traffic on Queensway at this moment in time, but if you consider School Road, the development at the other end outside the garden centre, which has had significant and protracted roadworks going on there, that may well have deterred some road users from taking that route in. So there's the potential that the traffic levels will increase again on Queensway, in addition to the vehicle flow from these additional houses. So I think at the very least, we as a committee should try and mitigate some of the most egregious disadvantages of the residents on that estate. Would be at least something. Thank you.
Councillor Farrington.
Thank you. Will you kindly go back to the map with the junctions? On the different parcels of land, are we talking about the same developer, or are they purchased by different housing developers? And then I've got a follow on from that.
So the initial phase is phase 1, and approximately a third of phase 2 was built by Kensington before the site was sold to Rowland Homes. That was around 2021. So Rowland Homes are building out Kensington's house types on this parcel. This isn't yet complete. There are some dwellings on that final arc there in this apartment building that haven't yet started. The construction compound is in this area at the moment. They are focusing on building their own house types on parcel 4, and they're moving from north to south along that.
So they will be responsible for 5 and 7, because the point I wanted to make really is, because things are brought to us in small packages in a way to consider the planning variables on our ring fence, we don't seem to have the ability to look at things holistically. So a lot of the points that fellow councillors have made, which I totally agree with just about everything that's been said today, and the cynicism about, putting infrastructure in place before the builds and alleviating the stress for people who buy properties in good faith. We don't seem to have it within our remit under the conditions of ring fence little planning applications to deal with it holistically, because what I would say is a point, and my question would be, how do we do this? Just make sure that middle road is built before any further parcels become developed, because we really don't want to, as Councillor Pittman said, get to the point in a couple of years where we're looking at the same thing again, and the can's been kicked down the road. I think really we need to start putting down markers where we say, no, before you start building the next phase, you do actually have to complete the infrastructure. And how would that be possible?
So in terms of, this is the road where the 450 dwelling trigger would apply. So that's linked to, or basically a capacity and that issue. So once you reach that number of dwellings, this road is required because there needs to be a link up to the junction up here, the signalised junction. So that's really, again, it's a highway capacity issue in terms of the level of traffic associated with that number of dwellings requires a connection onto the T6 road. So that's the kind of thinking behind that. So on that basis, you could build up to the 450 dwellings before you get to that point, which I suspect, without having the figures in front of me, is likely to be within parcel 6 if you were developing these out sequentially. And then there's a number of dwellings on this parcel 7 here that actually take access similarly to these on Parkinson Boulevard in phase 2 off this road. And so that would obviously be a trigger if you were to develop that parcel to construct it in tandem with that. But it ultimately it is down to that number, and that number will be based on the point at which that infrastructure is required due to the capacity of the highway network. Just in terms of Councillor Evans's point about the condition, I'd need some clarity in terms of precisely what we're asking the developer to do in terms of this mitigation, what that might look like. As I mentioned, at the moment, that the highway's built up. It doesn't have that final surfacing on up to this point. So that's that rumble strip that I mentioned as you go in through the access. But it is the surface is in place. It's really the final surfacing is almost an aesthetic issue rather than an issue in terms of an operational issue and whether or not it can take the loading of the vehicles. So if members were minded to impose that kind of condition, it'd have to be very specific in terms of what we are asking the developer to do and what the justification for that is on the basis that the Highway Authority haven't requested any such works.
Can I just interject there, Matthew?
Yeah.
If you, I would just keep it very, very simple. That says the developer is to make sure that no construction vehicles access the site through that temporary access. If they have an alternative route into the site, then that's the route that they should take. And there should be signs at the entrance of that site saying no access for construction vehicles.
So these are the signs that are already in place. I don't know if I can zoom into that, but those signs are already. Yeah, so these two A-board signs, I did take some photographs, but I can't get on that particular system. But that's what these boards actually say, no access for construction vehicles. Obviously, they've got that dedicated haul road in place, which all the contractors that visit that site, it's the Fox Brothers who bring that material onto the site and go through that whole road. They all know that that exists. They all use that whole road. There would be no reason for them to use this because it would be a more convoluted route for them to go through than it would be to use the whole road. So I'm just a bit, I don't really know what we would be asking them to do other than what they've already done here with the signage.
I'm just going to just interject here to try and help a little bit. I think basically we can see there's already, no construction traffic down there. The big question for me is, which would help if we can express it in some way, is to indicate that, monitoring and enforcement of that needs to happen. Because if it doesn't happen, then, what is already in existence, which I think should be sufficient as long as it works. And in a sense, I would like to be able to express some, desire that could be picked up from the residents, that this is something that will be monitored and to the best of our ability will ensure that the contractors abide by this. The other thing I was going to say is that in reality, before somebody says, how are you going to monitor it, how are you going to enforce it and everything, well, your residents are going to be aware that this is something that we've been concerned about and we're looking at. And I think that should reassure them. We'll soon hear if construction traffic is trying to use that road. I think there are good reasons practically why I don't think they will, because I don't think, and let's be fair, at the end, businesses operate sometimes on the basis of what they can get away with, but what's best for them. Now, in terms of this particular developer, I'm hopeful that they would comply with the restrictions that are already in place, because if they are not enforced and they're not followed, then you see, my concerns about this particular road were in terms of capacity, etc., and will it make a significant difference? Now, reading the report, it's saying there's ample capacity there. It shouldn't make a significant difference. But the one thing that would be a tipping point for me would be if construction traffic were to stray down there, because that, you don't buy your houses expecting that when you bought them to begin with. I know there are changes and it's a slightly more legal matter. But what I would say is if there was any way that we can somehow make it clear that we want to ensure that what restrictions are correctly in place, that are appropriate, we feel it's very important that they are complied with. That's fine. And I mean, we are talking about an amendment here before anybody's proposed or whatever, anything else. So at the moment, this is an academic argument, but that I'm going to put that back to the officers. Is there any way that we can encapsulate what I think committee are expressing, a concern here that these restrictions are upheld?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. If I can perhaps come in on this point. Obviously, the section that Councillor Evans read out from the report is where residents of that area have made that issue, have raised that issue in response to our notification of them of this planning application to them. I think there's three ways that we will deal with it. The first way is through the design. There's a whole road that's been created especially to deal with heavy traffic and get the heavy traffic, as Matthew says, directly, and you can see on the screen, directly from the wider highway network to where that heavy traffic needs to go. And with it generally being Fox Brothers, there is a steady pool of drivers who know that route, and why would they take a HGV through a residential estate when they don't need to, when there's obviously a much more direct route. So that's one of the elements. The second element is that there is planning conditions in place already that deal with construction management, so they deal with routing, hours of delivery, cleaning the roads, all those sorts of things that are standard with any large-scale construction project like this. And then the third element is the work that the planning enforcement team do in terms of visiting sites, engaging with site managers, following up on complaints that we may get, and making sure that the people who are ordering the stock from various places and ensuring that deliveries are received on the site are making sure that they're doing so in accordance with the plans. So whilst we have those mechanisms in place, clearly there are some comments that have been made in response to this application. So what I propose to do to sort of help committee is make sure that we contact, perhaps in a more formal way, contact Roland to make sure that that we've documented that they're aware of the restrictions and that they make sure that all their deliveries are taking the appropriate route. So that is something we will do. What I will also say is perhaps add some caution that may not solve the problem, because there's 138 and more dwellings occupied on there that may be having new boilers fitted, that may be having extensions, that may be having new driveways, that may be having other construction projects that are not subject to the planning conditions that Roland Homes are subject to, and will be receiving vehicles coming past properties on Salisbury Avenue quite legitimately, without, a flatback truck delivering a cement mixer and a load of roof trusses for an extension will look very similar to one that's doing the same for a new dwelling. So it won't be an exact science, but I appreciate, the sentiments of committee, and we will raise that with Roland.
And I think if it's made very clear that, the planning committee, that was a major concern.
Yeah.
And therefore, our concerns can be directly passed to Roland Homes. I mean, I think it's a valid point that Andrew makes, that there will be a level of individual servicing of the existing houses, and you can't prevent some traffic getting up there. But I think if we make it very clear, strong message to Roland that, I don't know if there is a record of this already, and again, it's difficult when you get some private sort of vehicles going up to service housing that's already there. It's difficult to discriminate sometimes, and people will jump on things in terms of residents looking at things. But I think then it would point out that, that's a major concern that the planning committee expressed, and that, we would expect the restrictions in place and all the authorised access to be complied with.
Yeah, can I just follow on from that? Chairman? Yeah, we have, in terms of records, we have a monitoring file for all the construction sites around the borough. So we do log communications to us, communications from us to them, so that there is, a record of when we've laid down the law, that's on that file. So that will be where the communication that I'm referring to is located.
Councillor Pittman, then Councillor Goodman.
Excuse me. Yes, thank you, Chair. Can I just check on the map, Matthew, please? I did mention the private road that used to lead up, well, it leads up to what was in the Easterley Kennels, and now there's quite a development up there. I still see those large vehicles parking on that entrance area. I'm wondering, and I think I mentioned this earlier, I don't think that leads into the estate, but I can't actually see anything on the map. It's just beyond the traffic lights, literally a few yards beyond the traffic lights going toward Queensway. So it's past the temporary exit. And I know it's a private road owned by whoever now owns all those units at the end. It just concerns me if they're using it as some sort of an agreement meeting point. Yes, you can see it bending round there to the new units where the kennels used to be. Well, just on the, if you go back toward Queensway, no, sorry, where you were enlarged, is there a road there that goes along the side of the Richmond Point? If not, then, as I say, it's just being used mainly as a parking area for the large vehicles.
Yeah, I think what you're referring to, the what was Eastleigh is known as Queensway Park
That's
Farm.
right, yeah.
And there is some activity taking place there that the enforcement team
Right.
are engaging with at the moment. There is no connection between that site and the development. As if Matthew was just to zoom out a little bit, you'd be able to see
Yeah.
that there's no physical
I
connection
didn't
between the
think
two.
so.
When I come through, I've seen those vehicles as well, and what I suspect is happening is that vehicles are using that entrance as perhaps as a holding area from
That's
time
my
to time
point.
before they go on to
Yeah.
the whole road and then onto the construction compound that it leads to further away. But where you will have seen vehicles that go down that track all the way to the buildings at the far end,
Yes.
they are associated with activities down there that like I say, we're engaging with them about.
I haven't seen any real problems, but just noticing those large, as you say, the vehicles, I was concerned that they may be slipping into the estate, as has already been mentioned. But obviously, that it's a holding area. That's probably a little more positive. Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any other speakers, any questions or any further comments that members want to make? So I have to invite, is there somebody that would like to propose or second? Councillor Dixon? Councillor Pittman is seconding. So we've got a proposer and seconder, and you've heard the action that we're going to take in terms of firming up the concern about the access road, etc., Councillor Evans, and we'll follow up on that. All those in favour, please indicate. All those against? Any abstentions? That was unanimous, thank you. Move on to item 2, page 52 of your report. Is this your hand?
This is me.
So thank you, Matthew, for your work. Andrew Stell will be the presenting officer on this particular item.
Okay, right, this, the second application relates to the enterprise zone at the airport. I might just put pointers, laser pen. So obviously the airport and the enterprise zone are very sizable areas, and the location plan that you've seen on the agenda paper is slightly confusing. So I will go through this presentation in slightly more detail than I would normally to explain that to you. Whether I go into the same detail that Matthew's just done with his presentation or not is debatable, but here we go. So this is the area in question where the main body of the application takes place. So to familiarise yourself, that's Squiresgate Lane, coming out of Blackpool towards the motorway, Halfway House Pub, Morrison's, and the retail units here. Amy Johnson Way comes through here, and then there's some car dealerships on this corner and various employment units as it wends its way around. And obviously you can see the taxiways and runways to the airport in the foreground. So this application is here because the development's major scale. It's not one that we've had any statutory objections to from the town council or anything like that. It's just because of the scale of the development. So as I said, that's where to locate the site within the sort of wider area. This is right on, and the application site trips over the borough boundary into Blackpool. So there is a very small element of the site relating to some highway works, which is within Blackpool. So there is an application with Blackpool Council for that element of the development. They haven't determined it because they're waiting for us to deal with the majority of it before they take the very minor bit that's in their area forward. But it's a scheme that falls within their scheme of delegation due to the modest scale of it. So as I said, the site has quite an unusual shaped red edge where we've got the buildings that take place here. This is Amy Johnson Way, so there are some highway works to Amy Johnson Way, and then this bit snakes over towards a brook which is off Queens Way, and that sort of narrow tram line of red edge is to deal with a drainage feature, which I'll cover in a second. So that's just an aerial image, again, to position where we are. You can see perhaps a little bit more clearly where the car garages are. This is a large building that's there. It's an outfit called JMax who relates. They have an airfield related operation. Obviously, they have direct access to the airfield, and really, what we're looking at here is something that's going to be more of the same in terms of that type of development. Again, Squiresgate Lane, some of the airfield, the older hangars over here. This is the air traffic control tower here, and obviously the other commercial developments over there. Couple of street view pictures looking either way, so you can see the scale of the buildings involved. This building here is the JMax building that I've just referred to. So it's buildings that are similar in size to that alongside it. I put this slide in at just chatting before the committee with the chairman. He was asking about the link roads through. So the site we're talking about is over here. Amy Johnson Way now continues along here. There is planning permission and development taking place for that road to continue through, as was discussed earlier in respect to the previous application, to continue through and connect onto modification of Common Edge Road. So those are the highway works that are taking place at the moment. You'll see, anybody who's going through there will see that the dwelling on the corner has been demolished to facilitate an increase in the capacity of that junction of Common Edge Road, School Road, and then Common Edge Road will come down here. You've got the garden centre here and the sports pitches here. So those works are underway, and with this site being off Amy Johnson Way, there's been the reason this application has been with us for the best part of 12 months before coming here is there's been some discussions with the Highway Authority at Blackpool about the design of the junction to Amy Johnson Way, bearing in mind that it's going to change its nature in the coming months and years. So the application itself, there is two parts. It's a hybrid application. So that means there are some elements that are applied for in full and some elements that are applied for in outline. So the elements that are applied for in full are effectively the infrastructure works for the outline development. So that's the road. So there's an increase in the width of Amy Johnson Way on this corner to increase the capacity and the scale of this junction that serves the site from Amy Johnson Way on the outside of the bend. There's an existing junction in that location which serves this JMax operation here, the blue rectangle, but that's to be increased in scale under this application. And then these internal road networks provided as part of the planning permission. This is where Blackpool come into it, because that blue dotted line is the boundary border. And so it's this element to the east of that blue dotted line that's within the Blackpool application. So you can see their part of the arrangements is relatively modest. So the outline application is a series of buildings served off those roads. So they've applied for, in outline with just the access applied for and all the other matters to be aggrieved through further reserved matters applications. But there will need to be some particular parameters to these buildings, as I explain later. So there are 5 buildings. So we've got one coming from the bottom. We've got 1, 2, 3 aircraft hangars, 1 double aircraft hangar. There's an employment building here, as a general employment building, which is obviously on the frontage to Amy Johnson Way. And then there's an area of car parking here. So those are the various elements that are proposed in outline as part of this application and are all entirely within filed. So this slide is the larger buildings, like I said, are aircraft hangars. So this is one of the features that means that they're here, is that they have access to existing taxiways that service the airfield and connect this area to the runways, which is obviously a key element of the airfield infrastructure. So, going through the buildings, I think I perhaps explained this previously, but we've got these 4 hangars, parking area and the employment building. Going through them individually, 3 of the hangars are identical and are 48 metres by 30 metres, big buildings, big enough to sit a typical holiday jet plane in. And I think one of the elements that they're looking at doing is whether this site could be used either to restore passenger flights to the area, or if not, to be used for servicing of passenger planes and doing MOT tests or whatever it is that they do with planes. So to do that, you're going to need some hangarage. So that's what these buildings are proposed for. So you can see that they're the size for a big plane, or obviously more smaller planes. There's also a larger hangar, which is designed to be 88 metres by 65 metres. So that's big enough to comfortably get 2 jets in like that if need be. And that's the building that goes here. So that's alongside the JMAX building that's currently on site. Then we've got this much smaller employment building. So this is building E, building located on the road frontage. So that's more of a car showroom size building that could be used for that use, or could be used for a more of a typical employment use. It's not designed for aviation activity. And gone past the slide, but finally there's an area of parking that's proposed over here. So there's 2 elements to that. There's airport parking, and then there's parking storage car parking, which I understand there are areas of the site that are currently used for storing cars associated with some of the car dealerships. So they are looking to continue that activity in that location. And again, it's something I'll touch later. So that's what we're looking at, and dealing with how we need to look at it. Obviously, planning policy is the starting point for any decision, and we have 2 key allocations in this location. We've got the area to the north of this green dotted line, which is within the enterprise zone and employment allocation. So there is a specific policy support for aviation related development within that area. So you can see that you've got your parking, the bigger hangar, one of the small hangars, and the employment building are within that area. To the south of that line, we have the green belt. So that's demarcated by this hatched line on the local plan here. So the 2 of the hangars are in the green belt. I think at this point I can show perhaps highlight this dotted line here as well. This is a water main that runs through the site, and that's part of the reason that the buildings are located where they are proposed on this plan, because that needs to be avoided in terms of putting buildings over the top of it. So that's giving us a constraint in terms of the layout of the site. Obviously, if it's aircraft hangars, they need to connect to taxiways. They also need to avoid this other existing infrastructure that I'm told is quite a significant water main that would be difficult to reroute. As a further constraint, we've got the line of sight from the air traffic control tower. So I perhaps I'll touch that. There's a slide later about air traffic safety. So the picture I'm trying to paint here is that we do have some, whilst it's an outline application, there are going to be some fairly fixed points that we would need to come to with any decision because of the existing physical and operational constraints around the site. So that's where I'm talking about. So in terms of set the policy background, aviation development in the enterprise zone meets the policy. So that's acceptable in principle. Buildings within the greenbelt need to pass the tests of greenbelt policy, and putting up new buildings for airport hangars is inappropriate development in the greenbelt. So greenbelt policy says we should resist inappropriate development unless there are the phrase used is that in yellow, which is very special circumstances. So my next slide will look at what are those very special circumstances that could support the erection of quite large buildings in the greenbelt. So the first of those is that this development isn't, the greenbelt is there to prevent Blackpool and St Anne's from merging. So on this slide, you can see a wider aerial image. So you can see the north end of St Anne's and the south end of Blackpool, and you've got this greenbelt area that encompasses the airport, the airfield, and other land around it. The development that we're looking at here is in this location, with one of actually the red circle's not quite right, but one of the buildings comes to where the laser pointer is now. So what we're faced with is perhaps a broadening of this part of development, but we're not getting a narrowing of the gap. So we're not bringing St Anne's and Blackpool closer together in terms of built development, but we are making Blackpool wider where it is relatively close to the northern end of St Anne's due to this triangle of development alongside Blackpool Road playing fields, which is already one of the more pinch points in the greenbelt. So in terms of a very special circumstance, the report takes the view that because we're not narrowing that gap, helpful, and in that it's not restricting the openness of the greenbelt in that respect. What we're also doing with the scheme, what the scheme does is that it sits the buildings alongside other big buildings. You saw from the images that the JMAX building is a big building. So whilst aircraft hangars are essentially always going to be large buildings, the buildings here are sited alongside existing buildings. So this is alongside the JMAX, this hangar's alongside that building, this hangar's alongside those buildings, and this hangar's just off the slide, but it's alongside other buildings there. So you've got a situation where the buildings aren't in the same way that perhaps these dwellings sit out on their own. From long-range views across from St Anne's, views from the greenbelt, views from the footpaths that there are over here, the buildings that are being proposed are not looking as isolated features in the greenbelt. they're sat against the backdrop of other reasonably sizable built development. Going the wrong way. Sorry. We've also got the physical constraints that I mentioned, the taxiways and the water main. We've got the aviation safety issue, so we need to avoid the line of sight from the air traffic control tower to the end of the runway, which is a legal requirement at present for air safety needs. And then we've got the situation of what the development's for, which is to provide new aircraft hangar facilities for the airport. The council has policies. There are sub-regional policies to support the ongoing activity at the airfield. The enterprise zone aims at supporting that. So this is a way of not only delivering modern hangar facilities for the airfield, but also allowing for the replacement of the perhaps more tired facilities that there are over on Squiresgate Lane, which might be a better location for other forms of development to take place under the umbrella of the enterprise zone. Obviously, this is the only airfield in the borough as well. So taking those factors together, the officer view is that those do represent very special circumstances. They couldn't be repeated elsewhere in the borough, and so that subject to conditions that these hangars are used for aircraft activities only, then that meets the very special circumstances test of Greenbelt policy and allows that the development to be acceptable in that respect. What that means is that because of the scale of the buildings, there is a need to refer this decision to the Secretary of State because of what's called the Greenbelt Direction, which makes sure that councils are council decisions that do involve development in green belts of large buildings are assessed by central government to make sure that that there is sound justification for that decision. So that's an element that's covered in the recommendation. So that's the hangars. Looking at the other elements, the parking areas, this is proposed here. So like I said, there's some airport parking and there's some wider storage parking. This is in the enterprise zone. It's not entire, some of it's for aircraft use, so that would meet the enterprise zone policy, but not all of it. The enterprise zone, the airfield policy does promote development that is supportive of the wider development. So I think we've taken a pragmatic view of that. This is for this to operate, that road needs to be built. That road would then get to allow that hangar to be serviced. So there is an element of enabling in that. There isn't a real impact on the openness of the green belt. It's not in the green belt, but from views out of the green belt, it's not impacting openness that way. So taking a view that is an acceptable element of this scheme, subject to a condition that it's only used for 3 years to make sure that it's not it's not there as a permanent use of that site, because that brings the policy concerns if it wants to be using enterprise zone land for what is a relatively low value use in storage of cars for car garages. The final element of the scheme not talked about in outline is the employment building here. That again would sit under the umbrella of the enterprise zone policy that allows for development that's associated with bringing forward airfield development. So it's a small part of the scheme overall. It's the part of the site that sits in a context with other employment uses off-site, so the car garages and the other employment buildings on Amy Johnson Way. And it's also the bit that you can't get a plane to most readily because of the position of the other development that's discussed here, and also the location of the hangars. So obviously it's a relatively modest building in size, and so I feel that that is an acceptable element of the scheme overall, subject to, again, conditions to make sure that it's used as an employment use rather than it becoming a retail use, for example. Okay, so those are the development that's proposed in outline. Perhaps some wider elements. Aviation safety has been another area where we've had key consultee objections that needed to be overcome. And there were three of those. One is the sight lines from the control tower. So that needs to look at the end of the runway. So that is achieved, but not by the building. The more southerly building interferes with that. So there will be a need to put a Grampian condition in, which was a condition that means that element of the scheme can't go ahead unless there is an alternative arrangement for air traffic control. So that could be a relocation of the air traffic control tower, or it could be a change in technology that allows air traffic control to be done remotely, which is something that I think that that technology is moving that way, but the legislation doesn't permit it at present. So that's a restriction that would need to be brought in on that one. There are also other navigation aids. There's all sorts of radar and measurement technology that's dotted around the airfield. Some of that would be sensitive to the heights of buildings. Some of it would be sensitive to if they were to use reflective cladding in the buildings. So there is a condition to ensure that, or there is a need for conditions to ensure that the buildings respect that technology positionally, but also in terms of the construction materials that they use. And then finally, there are some more obvious logistical controls that we need to put in place for aviation safety, making sure that big cranes don't suddenly appear on site, make sure that the lighting's positioned and designed so it's not confused with landing lights, that type of thing. Going the wrong way again. The access arrangement, as I said, that's off Amy Johnson Way. That's the area in question. That's the existing access that's going to, Amy Johnson Way is widened. You can see this grass verge here that allows for that. So that's going to widen the carriageway, widen the entrance, put pedestrian connections in, and has led to the delay whilst there's been some discussions technical discussions between the Highway Authority at Blackpool, who handle all highway matters in this area, and the applicants at Blackpool Airport about the design of that. But that's now not subject to an objection. The final element I'm going to talk about is drainage. Part of the scheme, as well as the road infrastructure, there's some drainage infrastructure that's being introduced. So that's part of the full element of the application. So the drainage is split across the site. So the northern parts of the site drains to a sewer on Amy Johnson Way. The southern part of the site drains, the surface water drains across a new swale, so a shallow ditch that's going to be constructed immediately to the south. So within the airfield, but on the perimeter of the airfield, immediately to the south of the playing fields that have recently been established at Common Edge Road. That's led to two objections from Sport England, who are a statutory consultee when you do work near to sports pitches. They initially believed that this element of the scheme was a road, so they objected on that basis. When that was clarified to them, they decided that they would object on the basis that the ditch could be putting people at risk should balls go into it or over it, and then the players on the pitch go to retrieve them. That's highly unlikely, I would say, because there's a, as you see from the image here, which I took from the access to the playing field last week, there's a 2.5 metre high fence that keeps the perimeter of the airfield secure, who would have thought? And will also restrict balls going over and will prevent players going over after balls because you're not going to climb that. What will happen in practical terms is that if any balls do go over, the patrols that patrol the perimeter of the airfield will just collect them and presumably take them back or keep them. But it means that I think the Sport England's objections were based around concerns over the safety aspects, and in seriousness, I can't see that there is a safety issue. I've put that to Sport England, sent them pictures that I took of the site, and I'm awaiting their comments. That drainage ditch, that drainage swale connects into a ditch, an existing ditch that runs from this is the footway at Division Lane, at the end of Division Lane, or it's on Queensway at the end of Division Lane. So there's a public right of way that heads south. Alongside that is Moss Edge Drain Sluice, which is this. And there's been some recent works to construct an outfall into it under a separate planning permission, and then this swale will connect to that outfall in due course. So this is 50 yards away from the Queensway. I walked down that path for 50 yards, got to this, another 20 yards down there, and that's where the ditch, and that ditch runs south and eventually into the estuary. So the idea of that is to provide, obviously the airfield has grass on it at the moment, big buildings, concrete aprons will increase surface water runoff. The swale is there to capture that surface water, to direct it towards this water course, and there's a hydro brake to ensure that it's released into it at a controlled rate. So all that's all part of the infrastructure works that's part of the full permission here to facilitate the bringing forward of the development. And that's the final slide I have, other than this summary slide which pulls together all the points that I've said. So we've got development that's in the airport where it's acceptable. We've got other developments in the Greenbelt, but it demonstrates very special circumstances to deal with the inappropriate development policy issue. There's conditions that address air safety. The highway access is fine. All the technical details about drainage and other matters, ecology that I haven't discussed, are all also acceptable. And this scheme is there to bring forward the enterprise zone development. So it's the next piece in that jigsaw of delivering the enterprise zone and the economic benefits that it will bring to the location as a consequence. So the recommendation is to delegate the decisions to the head of planning. That's subject to Sport England producing some further comments, which hopefully will remove their objection. We need to do the Secretary of State referral, and then there's a list of planning conditions that will be quite complex because of the hybrid nature of the application. But there's a list of subjects in the agenda papers. They just need drafting up and finalising on the powers delegated, or that I'm asking are delegated to ourselves. And that is the longest presentation I've ever given.
Thank you, Andrew. Before I bring speakers in, just a couple of questions from myself. Members will note that in the recommendation, below the recommendation, there are a number of stipulations there, and one of them obviously is to await the response from Sport England, which you've just articulated, what the nature of that is. I'm hoping that will be a positive one, bearing in mind the way you've presented it. And also that the Secretary of State is obviously involved in this, so anything is going to be subject to that as well, because of the Greenbelt status.
Yeah, that's a legal requirement that the council needs to go through. Members, we haven't had to do it for a while, but some of the members who may have been on the committee for a longer time will be familiar when we've had to do that in the past. But yeah, it's a process that is there as a safeguard, I suppose. But as central government designated the enterprise zone, and as this is a key element towards delivering that enterprise zone, you would expect that joined up thinking within government will see that as a logical step forward.
And just my other question is really just further clarification around this parking issue, because we're. Can you just go into that again in terms of the 3-year temporary approval? Because the other thing that I picked up was that you were talking about passenger travel, picking up at the airport, etc., and that's why the hangars are there. But actually, although it is passengers up to 45, I think, on a flight that they're taking in some of these aeroplanes, it is for corporate use. It's not for it's not for holiday, because they're not anticipating anytime soon, if at all, that there's any going to be any sort of holiday traffic coming through Blackpool Airport. That's been a statement coming out in the press. They've made that very clear. But what they are looking at is more executive and corporate jets and business use in terms of use with the related to the business enterprise, you know, the enterprise zone itself, Blackpool Enterprise Zone. So just clarify that parking thing, because I would imagine some might have some questions about that and why we need to do that.
Yeah, the parking area is to the west of this larger hangar. There's 2 elements to it. There's 89 spaces for airport parking, and then an additional 104 spaces for that's set out as parking storage. If you go to the site, and this aerial image is not an up-to-date one, but if you go to the site now, there are areas of parking near to this JMAX building that's currently being used, and that seems to be vehicles being stored associated with the adjacent car garages. So I assume that that's bringing a return into the enterprise zone, and I assume that that's where they're looking to repeat that and potentially expand it in the 104 spaces. From a planning perspective, as I said earlier, it's not a particularly high value use that really the enterprise zone should be used for. You know, if it's going to be an enterprise zone, we should be wanting to get good uses out of it. But equally, it's not a particularly harmful use in visual terms. There's large areas of concrete on the airport, obviously, so forming an additional area of concrete that's surrounded by buildings on 2 sides probably isn't that much of a landscape issue. More of a concern was that, okay, let's use this, let's accept this element as a way of bringing forward the road, allowing the existing activity to continue in the short term, but not sort of clear the pitch for something better to come forward in that location, potentially another hangar at some point in the future by giving it that permanent use. So that was the suggestion of a 3-year temporary condition. It's obviously something that's easy to undo at the end of those 3 years. It's not that they're putting a building up that then they have to knock down. It's just an area of hard surfacing. So it could equally be used if passenger flights do resume, if there are demands for, you know, for other parking arrangements on this site, that area could be put to. But that was the intention, was to try and take a pragmatic approach to support it, but make sure that we're not prejudicing the potential for better use of that area in the medium or longer term.
Thank you, Andrew, for that clarification. Councillor Goodman.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I've got a couple of observations and then a couple of questions for you, please, Andrew. I was intrigued, thinking, oh gosh, we might be getting some passenger planes now back to Blackpool, perhaps in a sneaky way by going for the hangars first. But I understand, as has been explained by our chair, that's not the case. It is a very popular airport for these corporate jets. I don't live that far away from it, actually, just beyond the Blackpool Road North, as a couple of our councillors here will say that they're very close as well. We have the air shows, we have the red arrows, which come literally over my house. And it is getting more and more popular, I have to say, Blackpool Airport as such. It is, of course, linked with BAE Systems when we have the tornadoes coming across to land when they're testing them. In a minute, I'll ask my question. The other problem was with Sport England. We spent many, many months on Common Edge Road with blockages and temporary traffic lights. Again, I'm going to say from Queensway. But that now has increased the amount of folk using those sports grounds. And again, particularly on a Sunday, it's very difficult to get by on Common Edge Road because of the amount of parking. Whether or not by extending that road that's already been built off Common Edge Road might improve the parking for the sports ground, I'm not sure. There is, of course, the issue with the drainage anyway. Can I go just to my questions, please? On the map you showed us, I was intrigued as to know which of the hangars actually fall within the Greenbelt zone. That's the one. Is the very large one, the extra large one, beyond that dotted line in the Greenbelt zone?
No, councillor, the green belt is to the south.
Right.
So it's the larger of the hangar and
It's
the
there.
one of the smaller hangars and the existing JMAX are within the enterprise zone area.
Yes. Does that include the employment building as well that may become a car showroom or employment?
Yeah, the employment unit is here, so that's also in the enterprise zone
that's
area.
right.
It's just these two hangars that are in
Below.
the green belt, and the swale is also in the green belt.
And one last question, the main water pipe, do we know how that could be protected in any way? Are there any further details on that? Which I think is that from the green zone into the enterprise zone?
Yeah, exactly. It runs up this way and then across into the development here. The idea of this application is to deal with the principle of that, of the development of those units. There would need to be a further reserved matters application that deals with the actual, whilst we've got indicative details that I've shown you, there will be a reserved matters application that will deal with their position and their actual size. Now, you can see on this plan that we've got this, the water main is the thick dotted line. Then either side of that, there is a thin dotted line, which is the easement. So that's 5 metre distance either side of the line of the water main, where United Utilities, as the undertaker control that, will not allow any development to take place. They've not objected to this application on the basis that the development is on the right side of that line. They would again be consulted on the reserve matters application, and at that point we would be looking at what measures they are looking for to make sure that infrastructure is protected, and then there would no doubt be that would deal with the position of the buildings, and there would also be operational measures that would need to be put in place to make sure that the guys on the ground don't dig it up by accident, because obviously it's a big infrastructure.
That's helpful. I think sorry, I've just thought of another one, the very special circumstances for the extra 2 hangars. I don't know whether that's very special circumstances in my mind, but I know you've explained that very carefully, so thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Thank you. Councillor Settle, and then
Thank you, Chairman. I'm very much in favour of this application. I can't see any downsides. Andrew's already covered the issue of the size of the buildings and the fact that they're surrounded by other buildings, so I don't see a problem there. But I particularly welcome the 2 aircraft hangars. Getting highly skilled people on aircraft maintenance can only be a good thing for the area in terms of employment. It enhances the enterprise zone, which in turn helps the continuing viability of the airport. So it's all good news to me. So I'm very much in favour of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Nixon?
Yeah. When you mentioned about the air traffic control building and put a directional line up where it may not be able to see if the hangars are built, it's sort of, the hangars will be blocking its way. How are they going to land the planes in the first place to get them in the hangars if the hangars are built? Which is first, the chicken or the egg?
They wouldn't be able to build the hangars, so the planes would still land because the hangars wouldn't be there. So they wouldn't. The condition would prevent the construction of those hangars until an alternative air traffic control system is put in place. So if they were to get permission to move the air traffic control tower to the south side of the runway, for example, that would allow that flights to operate and those buildings could then be built.
Right, okay, so we've got to move that first before anything else. Okay.
Yeah, which would be subject to a further planning application.
Yeah, and that's even further into the countryside then, isn't it?
Well, potentially, although there are some permitted development rights that allow some works to airfields without that. But the current situation is that is the location of the operational tower, and that needs to be able, the people in it need to be able to see the runway end when flights are landing.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions or comments that members want to make relating to this particular issue?
Councillor Evans.
Councillor Evans?
Yeah, I pick up on the Environment Agency there that they've got concerns that there may well be some high risk contamination that would be released by the development. And so obviously a detailed investigation should take place. But I note there on page 69 that is a condition. So that would be front and centre of our conditions, wouldn't it, Andrew?
Yeah, they're looking at this as, obviously it's a site it's part of the airfield. All sorts of airfield related activities may or may not have taken place on various parts of the site at various times. So they will understandably take a precautionary approach and require that suitable surveys are done of what has happened in this place in the past, and then presumably take that forward with some intrusive investigations before work starts to test the conditions underground.
Thank you. Any more comments, questions? Is anybody willing to propose? Councillor Settle proposing, Councillor Farrington seconding. All those in favour, please indicate. Anybody against? Unanimous. Thank you. Members? Point out right at the back of your report papers, on page 71, there is one appeal decision, and this was dismissed regarding a dormer extension in Kirkham. So that closes the meeting. I thank you for your attendance and your attention to the matters. Thank you very much. Thank you.